So I'll see if we can get a little bit of a discussion going on them. So there were several comments made about future exploration needing to allow for commercial activities as well as government activities. There also was this comment repeatedly about the no exchange of funds or minimizing exchange of funds. So one of the things we've ended up with in our traditional space cooperation is the space agencies decide what each side will be responsible for, and then we independently go contract with our industry to do something, so that we're spending our taxpayers' money with our industry. But the industry is much more global now, and so how do we get around the fact that nobody wants to send money abroad? We want to have a private sector role, but that private sector isn't necessarily national. You got thoughts on that? Scott, you want to start us off?
Well, sure. And this is a problem that is also facing the defense community as well, that more and more major weapon systems are, of course, multinational developments, and so people have to come to various arrangements and work shares. So I think the problem is a little bit easier if you're buying services internationally. So if you're buying communication services, or in the case of launch services, one can imagine that working a bit. Of course, we buy launch services from the Russians. I think it's much more difficult when it comes to development. And I think that, and also the technology transfer and export control rules are difficult. So what cooperation likely will push you toward is the systems with cleaner interfaces. Somebody building a box, somebody building else another box, having those come together, having them not built on a no exchange of funds kind of basis. But I think you can see an evolution where multinational contributions to a service would be possible. You've seen the Liberty proposal from ATK, with a European upper stage, and of course an American solid rocket booster on the bottom stage. That is not something that would have obviously occurred to me in the last administration, but it's a creative idea, and I think it's something that in this environment we could probably start thinking about. But service is easy, hardware hard.
Anyone else want to comment? Graham?
Well, I invite anybody to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think most of our industries are in fact national. Perhaps Astrium and the EADS are perhaps one of the few two truly multinational companies. If I think of Boeing, you would see that as a national U.S. company that has a lot of partners around the world, but it's Boeing's choice, if you like. It's not a multinational country registered in the Bahamas or something. So I'm not sure that the hardware problem, export controls and ITARs is certainly an issue. So there's no question about that. But this is not like Joint Strike Fighter scenario, I don't think. We might. I mean, who knows? At some point. So I'm not sure it's as problematic as it might seem.
Well, I believe the starting point would be that an exploration program is, in the first place, a government-designed architecture where governments decide to transfer certain functionalities to private industry, like is now done for the ISS, where NASA decides to give transportation to the ISS to commercial industry. This might be the first step. This might be that it be more in a national frame, so that Europe tries to provide, or let's say, engage its European industry. We would probably have problems to submit ESA funds, for instance, to American industry. On the other hand, if there is reciprocity, and we see that services available on European soil are also purchased by partners, that, so to say, let's say, as a quid pro quo, I would imagine that it's not a barrier which is, let's say, unsurmountable. I don't want to export our geo-return principle to the world, of course. I mean, this,
All right, well, while we're talking about ESA principles, let me take advantage of your ESA expertise and ask, we've had a number of comments about the IGA for space station having been set up with the U.S. lead role. There were a couple comments about more interdependence likely in the future. And for those of us in the U.S., sometimes we look at ESA and it's hard for us to understand how you have one country, one vote, but very widely varied levels of financial contribution. So how does that work, and how is that maybe a model that we should be thinking about in terms of governance?
I know about studies and investigations in how far ESA could be a model for governance or space for an exploration program, but ESA of course works as member states decide to implement their space activities through ESA, and they contribute funds to ESA, so that is certainly not a no exchange of funds model. The opposite, they give us funds and they implement programs, and so far I don't see that is directly applicable to a multilateral international exploration program. What is certainly true is that the mechanisms to allow us to have a quite efficient program with 18 up to 19 member states might provide models in how far achieving consensus in difficult situations. We certainly have experience in making progress despite quite different interests in the beginning, which then we are able to merge and to bring to a consensus at the end. This kind of expertise might be helpful in a more complex international cooperation environment where we may help. But the model as such, having member states providing funds to ESA and we then procure or acquire space hardware and services, I have to think about, but I don't think it's immediately transportable to an exploration program.
Yeah, I was thinking more in terms of if the reason for a U.S. lead role is because we're the largest investor. That's one reason why it's hard for the U.S. to give up the lead role. Yet in ESA, you have some major investors in particular programs, Germany and Space Station, France and Ariane, for example, and others who are only giving maybe 1%, 2%, but collectively, you are able to reach an agreement. But the influence is in a more subtle way than the votes at the council, I think.
And you're right. In the space station program, for instance, Germany is prominent when the launches the French. Nevertheless, I wouldn't say that they have a lead role in these programs. They contribute most, and automatically, naturally, they also involve a stronger vote in the governing bodies. But it is still democratic. If they do not convince other partners to go with them, and they have not the 50% threshold passed, then they will not be able to make decisions. So it is true. Leadership. Europe would not be afraid of the leadership of the US in an exploration program. Leadership is something very positive. It requires responsibility and commitment of the leader that we are very much looking for. In fact, the fact that we are not so far able to initiate a global exploration program may be that we have not a strong leader at the moment trying to bring those kind of things together. So we are not afraid of leadership in the US in an exploration program.
I was going to sort of add that the ESA system, I think, works actually quite well in the European context because there is a larger political rationale for it. I mean, if you think of what is a European institution, ESA is probably one of the most prominent examples of that. And so the whole post-war experience of European political integration, of binding countries closer together after the fall of the wall, bringing in other Eastern European members. So the Justiciar system, I think, was a very brilliant solution to how to get states with different levels of development and capability and economics and bring them together. But it was because Europe had a broader political agenda that it was trying to deal with, and I think ESA met that need. And so it's hard to export to exploration, not because exploration is a technically different subject, but because the political contention is very different.
Graham, you made a comment about it being hard to define what the content is. I mean, if this is a program's evolutionary over a long period of time. So do you have a thought on how we approach, sort of who defines what and when in such a partnership?
Well, I guess I'll take a page out of what the International Space Exploration Coordination Group is doing now. The 14 agencies that make up this group is, there are various working groups underneath this overall activity to develop a global exploration roadmap, one of which is an architecture working group, another one is an objectives working group, we're just about getting objectives. So we are looking at architectures, scenarios, objectives, and all the other things that are necessary for multiple destinations, since we don't know really where we're going to go yet past the space station. So it includes the moon, the libration points, Mars, of course, asteroids, near-Earth asteroids, and so on and so forth. So we're looking at a variety of different destinations, different exploration missions, if you like. So I could envisage I mean, this might be a bit naive, but you know, one can envisage a rather expansive exploration program, which includes near-Earth asteroids, the moon, and Mars. And not all parties will want to go to all three places. But amongst the 14 agencies, or however many we want to have, some will want to do some will want to do the other, some will want to do both, and so on and so forth. And so that could be, if the exploration program is being done within an overall framework, then you end up with what's the phrase, the sum of the whole is better than the parts, or whatever that phrase, you know what that phrase is. And then you can just do that. You can do the individual missions through bilateral and multilateral arrangements under some larger umbrella. Because I don't think, from what I've seen so far, I don't think we're going to have either a consensus necessarily at the basic level or the global political consensus on the next destination. I think it's going to be plural for possibly some time.
But wouldn't we nevertheless need some starting point? I mean, we cannot end in flexibility. We need to start with a very concrete, I would believe, as an engineer again,
yes,
with a very concrete and well-defined program, which might be small and not very ambitious at the beginning, but it may be the starting point then to grow and to have incremental growth. And this program must be, I assume, very well-defined, and we need probably very traditional instruments to find agreements among the partners. Mm-hmm. And the flexibility is rather in the not well-defined future exploration, evolution path of such a new business in the beginning. But I think we have to start with something very concrete and soon.
I agree. If I were king for a day, personally, I think I'd be wanting for us to focus on a Mars sample return mission and all the that's complicated enough. Requires lots of precursor missions, which a lot of nations, I think, would be interested in contributing to.
One of my French colleagues, who shall remain nameless, years ago told me that, well, you said that Europe doesn't have a problem with U.S. leadership. Through much of my career, I've heard a lot of disparaging comments about U.S. leadership, the comment from my French colleague was, we're always going to complain about U.S. leadership and why, we should be treated more equally, but we really want you to lead. So it's interesting working your way through the motivations and the public rhetoric, yes. Scott, you mentioned some areas where the success in the international framework was because we had a bottoms-up approach, where you had the technical expert develop some things like our orbital debris mitigation practices. Are there some other areas that come to mind that we could be focusing on at a technical level now or near term that would help facilitate our ability to do some of this future cooperation?
Sure. I think the ones that are nearest, most immediate are in space situational awareness and in communications. I think particularly the work in the Consultative Committee on Space Data Standards, and I can't fully give up my previous life in Space Common Nav, and so we'll have to, flog the importance of delay-tolerant networking. for that, because any sort of communications or navigation work necessarily needs to be interoperable across all these. It needs to be. You need to think of common utilities that we'll have to plug into. So an area that can cover across all types of destinations and all types of missions, communications, navigation, power, launch, of course, fairly obvious. And so to the extent we could get technical experts in each of these areas making advances, at the very least, in interoperable open standards for ComNav and collision avoidance and so forth, I think that would be good. A really tough one, and I don't know quite how to deal with it, really is nuclear power. Because I think nuclear power is absolutely critical if you're going to go to Mars. I don't think you do Mars without it. I think it's possible to imagine doing the moon without nuclear power. I don't see how, but I think it's really beneficial if you have it. Nuclear thermal rockets are very competitive, although there are other alternative ways of getting there. But nuclear power requires very long lead items, and it requires a lot of experience, and there's a lot of concern, certainly in the international community, in talking about nuclear power sources in space. So I think that technical people could start on the long lead items for nuclear power sources and build up some expertise to where people got more comfortable with that and got comfortable with the safety rules. We're certainly not going to be doing some of the things that were done in the Cold War, ordering nuclear reactors that crash into Canada and other places. Let's not do that again for anybody. That is a subject I'd like to see some more discussion on. Certainly the U.S. Is facing a shortage of plutonium-238, so we're looking at rebuilding that capability in the U.S. I don't think we want to see many other countries producing plutonium-238, so we don't want to encourage a market in that area. But that would be kind of the hard question I would suggest for people to think about.
And I'll mention for the audience benefit that the space station partners are working on international standards for docking, and that is another method of building in some future interoperability opportunities. And if you look at the lessons learned document that all of the partners on space station put together, there's a whole section on standards and interfaces that were identified as if you're going to go do future human exploration, here's some areas where having that commonality would be a good thing. It would help with interoperability. It would help reduce costs for all of us long term if we're using similar systems instead of having to do all the detailed analysis. And if you're in a program where you're concerned about logistics, not having to supply many different kinds of systems, but having one, sort of where you can plug in different things would be helpful in that regard. So,
and in that sense, developing those technical standards doesn't commit you to cooperation.
correct.
And the political decision is still reserved as to whether or not it happens at any particular time. But if you don't have those technical standards in place, then the option of political cooperation is not even on the table. So it's a necessary precursor step. It doesn't really prejudice you.
Right. But let's talk about, so we don't have a commitment with others, but eventually downstream the political environment changes and you want to add new partners, or a new partner has come along with increased capability. So I think there was a theme running through all the presentations about having that flexibility, the ability to bring in other partners. So let's explore that a little bit more. Do folks have thoughts on a good way to do that, or the prime considerations you need to have in mind? What are some of the things we need to take into account to allow that flexibility? Graham?
Well, as you well know, then, when we looked at the IGA, at our State Department, the original partners to bring Russia into the program, we came up with an integrated plan, or I forget what we call it now, but anyway, the idea was to adopt the so-called minimalist approach. We thought all we would have to do was to add Russia and a comma, a new partnership, sprinkled out throughout the IGA.
And that lasted, what, a nanosecond?
We'd be done. The first set of agreements took 4 years to negotiate. It took 4 years to renegotiate the agreements to bring Russia into the program. So we've got to find a way to bring in partners without having to, if we're governed by a treaty, and it's going to be a treaty of some sort, even if it's an MOU in other people's terminology. And I don't think a whole bunch of bilateral MOUs is a good idea either. We're going to have to find a way for either including everybody we could possibly think of at the beginning, which I think is probably unrealistic, or setting some pretty stringent ground rules that it's an up and down vote. If you want in, you accept it as it is. And I think there are, people like Robin Frank and others can help us here, but I think that there are ways to do this through an annex in the agreement that we, in the Canada-US Civil Space Cooperation Agreement, we can bring in other government departments through a change, just an exchange of diplomatic notes, which means we don't reopen the IGA. But it does mean that if NOAA wanted to join, or if the Environment Canada wanted to join, which is what we're hoping will happen, they have to accept the language as is. Well, presumably they could, shouldn't be a problem because it was our respective governments that agreed to that language anyway. So there are legal ways to bring people in, to set up the initial agreement so you can bring people in without having to reopen the whole thing. But I'm not a lawyer.
Graham, you pointed out in your presentation that one of the biggest achievements of the space station program is that we learn to manage such a complex program with so many partners. So, by deduction, it seems to be something which we have to learn to cooperate with partners. It's not something which we simply plug in as a new feature. We need experience in doing so. In particular, in a program which is complex and depends probably on contribution of these new partners. So, my fear is that why not also looking for opportunities to train those kind of partnerships. As the ISS could be, it is a training in the platform for exploring technologies, operational instruments, etc. It could be investigated whether there's also a platform to get in touch with future partners and to learn to work with them in a very operational environment, perhaps in utilizing the space station or whatever it would be. That is certainly a decision to be taken by all partners, but I think it's a worthwhile consideration to prepare for a larger partnership in exploration.
You also raised the point of the need for U.S. leadership, and I didn't mention that in my presentation, so I know you want to say something, but since I'm non-U.S., I would second Andreas's comment that space exploration is someone's going to have to be in charge somehow, some way. We have made consensus management work, but someone's got to chair the table. And I think realistically that is going to be the U.S. Maybe it's co-chair. I don't know, but rotate.
Well, actually, that's actually meshed with a point that I wanted to make, which was if you think about the ESA activities where there was multiple nations involved in making decisions, that ESA also learned from the experience with the European Launcher Development Organization, with ELDO. Prior to Ariane, there was a number of fairly disastrous attempts to build a launch vehicle until France was a leader and took a large role in system engineering activity that helped make it a success. I was recently part of an effort of the National Research Council on impediments to interagency cooperation. Everybody thinks interagency cooperation is a wonderful thing. They're all part of the same government. They all speak the same language, use the same money. Why don't you guys cooperate and better? It sounds very politically appealing. And of course, what we did after looking at a lot of examples of it, we came to a different conclusion, which is absolutely positively don't do interagency cooperation. Not because it's not politically a nice thing to do, but do it only if you absolutely positively have to. If there's some compelling scientific, technical, or political rationale to do it. And the reason is because you tend to start violating the precepts of good system engineering when you bring in these other entities. Multiple interfaces, whose acquisition system is in charge, who makes decisions, how to adjudicate. So that if you then do it, you should there's a kind of a checklist of things you need to be able to answer as to how you're going to resolve these issues. So that, I think what Space Station did is people learned this difference between this is the decision we need to take for good engineering management and safety, and here are the things we have to do to keep our partnership together. And the two are not necessarily the same. That we can have a much more politically balanced and inclusive process, much more democratic process among the partners, without necessarily compromising good engineering. And that wasn't always clear at the beginning. But the focus on the space station as a single destination, as something that actually had to work, where people's lives were at stake, I think that helped clarify those two different sort of roles. So in the process of looking at governance, I should stress that we not lose sight of good engineering practice, that what we do for political purposes should not put at risk the very mission that we're trying to accomplish.
So the concept of interdependence or who's on the critical path was mentioned a couple of times. And I think there were some comments about we probably have increased interdependence. So let's explore that one a little bit more. You want to start, you guys? I think you mentioned it in yours.
Yeah. For instance, look to the transportation infrastructure. Any future exploration program will have as a core element transportation. Without access to space, we will not have an exploration program. All the partners in discussion now have own transportation means. I think it would be a waste of resources not to consider to integrate those existing ones, perhaps to agree on modification on certain ones, into a larger common transportation infrastructure, which certainly would create interdependencies among the partners in the most core element of an exploration program. So it will come up automatically when we take into account available competencies and capacities that already exist in with the partners, and try to build something which makes best use of it. So it's almost an automatic process. The time of the space station where Europe was financially and perhaps not from the capacity, not in a position to provide core elements, are the past. I mean, we have now entered a phase where partners can contribute elements which are worthwhile and helpful for a scenario, and automatically create an environment of interdependence.
I think we've also found from our space station experience that having multiple providers of certain key systems is extremely helpful for sustaining the program. Because if one system is down, you have another that you can turn to keep going. Other thoughts on this?
Well, I think one of the problems that will come up as we get into things more ambitious beyond space station is really the overall health of the industrial base. It's not just at the prime levels, but at the second and third tier levels. And therefore, I mean, to your point about having multiple sources of supply is a good thing. Space transportation, though, I think is particularly problematic. I mean, more and more countries are looking to have their own launchers and provide their own launch systems, but there's not necessarily new demand coming to the market. And so as a result, the U.S. used to have a large role in the international launch market. The U.S. has largely been driven from the field. Ariane and the Russians are the dominant providers. But it's incredibly difficult market. It's hard to make a rational decision about sizing that market as more and more countries decide for their own prestige regions, autonomy regions, or whatever, for non-market reasons, that they want to have a launch system. And therefore, in order to try to mitigate the cost of the launch system, they take their own national payloads off the international market, and thus it becomes more and more difficult. Now, one could argue that, well, there ought to be more of an open free trade in launch services, and people should be able to buy and sell wherever they want to go. But that runs contrary to the industrial policies of many of these countries. While I'm a fan of commercial launch services and promoting commercial launch practices, I have to wonder whether or not, in an environment which is basically competing against other parasail enterprises, that's really a viable policy, as opposed to an industrial policy rationalization exercise. But if you do that, you wind up essentially blocking innovation and new arrivals from being able to offer those services. So there's that balance between what I want, sort of efficiency, effectiveness, in a market where there's still inadequate demand and still too heavily dependent on government spending.
Specifically about partners on the critical path, I think there's a single word, and that's trust. But trust is earned, it's not given. And I think all the space station partners are on the critical path now because they earned the right, perhaps, and through necessity, through other means, but they earn the right as well. And I hate to think in terms of two-tier partnerships, but maybe in exploration. There are those partners who it's agreed can be trusted to provide critical path, and those that need to earn that trust. And so, they have to kind of work into a stronger critical role, if you like. Just an observation.
Like the law firm, you have to start as an associate before you can become a partner.
Yeah, something like that.
One additional thought on that. I think we have also to redefine or consider the term of critical paths. We wouldn't consider Columbus or the Japanese laboratory module being on the critical path of the space station. Nevertheless, without these elements, we would probably have a quite meager integration program, which is finally the rationale and the purpose of it. So although it is technically not on a critical path, it is programmatically and politically on a critical path. So I would think that also an exploration program would see a number of elements which are perhaps technically not on the critical path, but are substantial for creating the overall program success, which for whatever political question we want to have it as an answer.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that when, in the case of the space station after the Columbia accident, when there was a very serious discussion about simply stopping where we were, get the U.S. module up. Do we really want to launch and take the risk, given at the time, of adding the international modules? One could make an argument that the station was sort of fine where it was. But I think that when you then had a very serious discussion at senior political levels with all the other partner governments, beyond just the space agencies, the answer was very clear. We absolutely, positively had to try, and therefore the U.S. had to go in to honor its commitments and to do so. I mean, I think there would be understanding if we actually physically could not do it, that was a different situation. We had to try, if it was at all possible. And so, yes.
You can give it a name, U.S. Core Complete.
U.S. Core Complete, yeah. Even had an acronym for it. But the answer is those items, as Andrea said, while not technically on the path, in fact the station was somewhat stable without it, as far as the mission of the station was concerned, those items were absolutely on the critical path. There was no station without the international partner modules.
Okay, let me see if we have some questions out in the audience. Yes.
Graham brought up the issue of the role of space station stemming from space station freedom efforts on. One of the critical elements of that was something called the Robotic Systems Integration Standards. We started off with some very lofty requirements. The space station shall be robot friendly. That was the system of requirement. Okay, and had to end up writing the book. And we did that in partnership, in particular with Canada, but with all the international partners and all of the NASA standards and work packages. On a detailed level, based on the notion that we had to find a way to make it work across all of the elements, all of the distributed systems. That allowed a focus for international cooperation, which resulted in arguably an unprecedented example of the different work packages and partners working together from the start. Level 2 worked when it came to robotics. So, given that, what can we use to inform our efforts going forward, where we can construct experiences and opportunities, where we can work together to have a framework that lets us facilitate programs, facilitate what you're referring to about other partners, both on a technical level as well as the overall organizational level that you folks are trying to lay groundwork for.
I think a very classic example is what you mentioned, what Skip Hatfield presented this morning, and that's the Common Birthing Docking Mechanism. They have a different acronym this week, but I'm not sure. But I see that as huge in the era of exploration. You know, if the world can agree on a common berthing and docking mechanism, look at the opportunities that opens up. And if the Chinese adopt that system, who knows? We might see them, we might see a shuttle near follow-on kind of, you know, a space, whatever, you know. We might see them docking to the space station, who knows? I mean, or in some future endeavor. I mean, that's just one of them, I think, but it's all the view of the total standards.
I'd want to see the atmospheric standards, you know, as well, and the environmental systems that would have to come together, you know, as well in that. But I mean, but that it goes back to Gary's point about what is the system level requirement that you're trying to get at, and that requires a definition of what the political objectives, to some extent, are for the cooperation. You in fact want it to be open, or you wanted to have a mixed strategy of robots and humans, or you want to have these common standards in order to make decisions later about who to partner with. So there's actually governance questions buried in what seemingly sound like technical subjects.
Yes, sir.
For Greg. I can't be all bad. My son lives in Montreal. He loves Canada and he never wants to come back. Now, having said that, there was discussion about ratification of extending the ISS to 2020, and it came out that Canada was the only party that hadn't ratified yet. Do you know about that?
Yes, I do. I mean, somewhat. An election, the government was brought down and there was an election called. So the answer didn't get back in time. I mean, so that's all I can tell you at this stage. We are now in election, but thankfully in the parliamentary system it's only 5 weeks long, so we will have a new government by May the 2nd, May the 3rd. And then the rest of that paperwork there'll be a government for the paperwork to go through the system. So I can't say more than that at this stage, but that's what happened.
You may have a government before we have a budget.
Okay, if you could just pass the mic over to the next.
Right, yeah. Talking about governance, you're focusing on basically space flight. It's like flexible path sorts of things and building on the space station. But if we ever decide to really focus on Mars, then in addition to the space flight stuff, there's the ground segment on Mars, much of which can be, a lot of simulation work can be done on Earth. And in addition, at that point, all the robotic precursor missions become critical key path stuff. So would you at that point take the governance model and expand it to both Earth-based simulation activities and precursor robotic missions on Mars?
The International Space Exploration Coordination Group, the ISEC, it's not ISEC, it's much easier to say. This 14-agency group includes as part of its work the analog activities. So analog is part of our thinking. So there would be no reason why the analog activity would not be. And they're expanding hugely. I mean, analog activity started with Devon Island, but now we've got the January thing in Hawaii every year, and Arizona, and so on and so forth. And Spain, I think.
Well, there is the Planetary Exploration Committee had a meeting recently, Peter sponsored, and also working with COSPAR. And I think if you go to Space Policy Institute website, you can find a link to the PEC's briefings, and where we talked a lot about analog environments. And those are very technical and astrobiology oriented and so forth. But just as Andreas said about using space station as a way to train other emerging space agencies in multilateral coordination, you could certainly imagine using sort of analog systems to train and test out, different kinds of decision-making mechanisms. And I would then refer to the NRC report on interagency impediments and say, here are things to look for while you are doing these kind of analog, environments. And so I fundamentally don't see a reason why you couldn't get some benefit out of the analogs, not just technical, but also from a managerial and governance standpoint. We could have simulated crises, we could simulate governments falling, we could simulate budget gaps, there's all kinds of things that communication delays, there's all kinds of things that could be done. But this actually brings up an important point, and one of the reasons why, as some people here know, I am not a let's go to Mars now person. I tend to be more of a lunar oriented person, not only because I'm interested in the moon and interested in the economic side of it, but I think there is a process by which you have to train the organizations about how to fly. That the space station program was not just a technical test bed, it was an organizational test bed, and we learned how to do multilateral sort of cooperation. We have not flown beyond low Earth orbit in a generation. And so before we go next, it's not just a matter of getting the technology and lighting the rockets up, it's a matter of training our respective organizations how to fly. And so there is a building process about then operating in deep space, operating on another planetary surface, putting that into place so that when you make decisions about, doing something like Mars, you're doing it off a very, very rich background. And I think that past human spaceflight experiences teaches one to be conservative about what you don't know before heading out. So I'm definitely a fan of a stepping stone approach on both technical and organizational needs.
Hello. Yesterday in panel 3, our Russian colleague mentioned something that actually shocked me a little bit as a scientist, and that was that the various partners who are presently on station are conducting independent and in many cases duplicative and certainly disparate experiments, and they don't necessarily share the data. When I spoke with him earlier, he's here in the audience right now, but he mentioned that it's not because of the will of the scientists. It comes from a higher directive, and that is that there is not the sharing of data. That one seems like one that would be amenable to a fix. That doesn't require equipment, it doesn't require a new treaty or anything. It just seems like it can be fixed. I was wondering what the committee or the panel might think about fixes on the sharing and distribution of common data, generated, any data basically generated on ISS.
Right. I actually think there is a fair amount of sharing of data, so I'm also surprised to hear the comment. But I can tell you maybe one of the factors that drives it to some degree, and that is we had to come up with a way of allocating utilization capacity on the station when we set the program up. And so the volume, the crew time, the power, and so on, there is an initial allocation given to each of the partners on a percentage basis. Then once that allocation has been given, that's just the starting point. That's not the you must protect this and not share anything. That's your initial allocation. And as a partnership, there are groups like the International Life Sciences Working Group where the view is it makes no sense to build, everybody have their own glove box, or for materials research, for everybody have their own furnace, that we should share. And so in the life sciences community, we actually put out coordinated international calls for science proposals. And so there is somebody who needs to be the lead so that, and take responsibility for this is out of my allocation, this is priority enough to be counted against my allocation, but there isn't a prohibition against sharing data. So I don't know, my colleagues might want to add.
From ESA point of view, we have usually a scientific utilization of the space station. So we tried, not very successfully, to get private industry to utilize the station, which was not successful. Those companies, when they invest own money, of course, they would have a right to keep the data for their own purposes. But the data are, in fact, we have a big experiment data library, which is, I think, even accessible by quite everybody. It's not even internal, it's available. What NASA has is a national lab concept where you invite third parties, mainly non-NASA government agencies to use it. I don't know whether those agencies may have also rights to keep data for themselves.
Yes, Yes, if they're paid for the research. And so if it's the National Institutes of Health, they would follow their data practices. If it's a private company, it's going to be proprietary data. I will say that there's probably far less sharing between the original partners and the Russians, because when we entered into this renegotiation of the agreements, we tried to get Russia to join in this distribution of the allocation of ops and utilization, and Russia did not want to do that. And it was very hard to figure out, when we did the original allocation of what the percentages were for each of the partners, what the value of their contribution was worth in terms of percentage utilization. That was based on your on-orbit elements. And so we tried to do a similar thing with Russia early on, but we could never find a formula that the Russians would agree to. And so they finally came to us and said, why don't we use the keep what you bring philosophy, which meant you guys over there, US, Europe, Canada, Japan, you have this nice percentage thing worked out. All yours, you can keep doing it, but we're going to keep the Russian allocation to ourselves. And we won't cross the interface unless we have a specific agreement. And we finally decided to agree to that as a partnership. So the Russians have complete rights to all of their utilization contributions that they bring up. And then among all the other partners, we have a far more integrated approach. So there is a little bit of that distinction, which may have flavored it as well.
I'm glad to hear that. I was hoping that was the answer. It does, however, beg the question. My esteemed colleague, who is a scientist who is working on station research, has that approach.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think Bill Mackey wants to
Yeah, so to follow
clarify or
that,
correct me or
Bill,
something.
sorry, yes, to follow that on a little bit more, Lynn, Bill Mackey with the Canadian Space Agency. With that model that you just described about the original partners in the USOS in Space Station Freedom, under Reagan's authorization, you then brought in the Russians as a partner for us all to operate the International Space Station together. Now, would you recommend the same model for a mission to Mars? The bring, own what you bring approach.
I think, I'm going to come back to first principles and our first presenter, which is you need to know what that mission is first to know how you would govern it. And so I would say an endeavor of going all the way to Mars is a pretty complex, integrated activity, and it would be hard to divvy it up and say, okay, I'm only providing this and taking back the return, I'm providing that and taking back the return. My vision of it would be a far broader sharing, more on the model of our space science missions, where everybody can contribute a science instrument, and but everybody gets the data from everyone's science instrument. So I think I would look for a more integrated approach. I saw a question over here. Yes, the young lady with the microphone.
Thank you. This is an invitation to speculate some more upon your speculation, your speculative mission. I mean, when the IGA was developed, I guess the global spacefaring community looked a lot different than it does today. If you had to speculate a little bit about what you think specific members would contribute to a mission to Mars, what would you say? Like, what more concretely would each one do? Who would they be? And is there any interest or any possibility to look at involving in a substantial way countries like China?
Okay. Graham, since you've been involved with the ISEG and what individual partners' interests are, maybe we can start with you.
Okay. So there are 14 agencies in the International Space Exploration Coordination, ISEC. So that includes all the usual suspects, plus countries such as India, China, Korea, Australia, Ukraine, this is beyond, think of the space station as G8. It started off as a G7 program, became a G8 program. We've now got G14, sort of, in ISAG. My personal fantasy is this should be G20. Scope, in scope. I mean, there are many space agencies out there who are not part of ISAG, not because they're not allowed, we're wide open. But we know there are others out there who could and may want to make at least a modest contribution to involved in science.
Do you have a sense of particular interests of the nations with regard to Mars? I know the focus has been a lot on the moon more recently, but to what extent have folks kind of declared particular interest in Mars? Yeah. Lunatics and Martians, yeah.
Before President Bush announcement for the vision for space exploration going back to the moon, I would say the large majority of the international community was, no, I shouldn't say that. The community was probably split. Europe, Canada was much more interested in Mars. The Chinese, the Japanese, and the Chinese, Japanese, and Indians have a very strong interest in the moon. If the US were to go back in a globally coordinated fashion to the moon, there'd be a lot more countries would join, I'm sure, including Canada, I would hope. But our scientific interest still remains largely with regard to Mars. So it's split. In fact, the ISAG is developing objectives and it's collecting information from all the agencies, and the agencies have collected information from our own scientific communities and other communities, so it kind of represents, we hope, somewhat of a national feeling. And I was looking through all the objectives the other day and the color codings, and it's perfectly clear, at least to me, in looking at the matrix that was just developed, that it's Mars and the moon are the primary destinations of interest by most countries. And probably at this stage is a bit 50-50 split, perhaps between the moon and Mars. But I agree with Scott, and I think the next logical place to learn is to go back to the moon. It's a hell of a stretch for the next human step to be a Mars mission. There's an awful lot to learn.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I think has been striking on this question of international cooperation is because you have countries that have different levels of development. Some of the discussions about Mars, particularly for some of my Asian colleagues, has not gone over well, not because they don't have recognized a scientific interest in it, but they sort of feel that it leaves them out. They feel that, well, that's just not something we can really do, or it's not something we can be an equal player in, but the moon is something they go, that's hard, but we think we know how to do that. So there's more of an opportunity to be an equal player there. So I try to encourage them by saying, the moon is a near-Earth object. You can go see it at night. There it is. So it's encouraging.
Yeah. I would say if you want to go down the path you started on to speculate at who might do what we've seen over the history of our activities is that there's sort of a natural evolution where countries have a niche of expertise. So the fact that Canada developed the robotic arm for the shuttle made them a natural for moving into robotic systems for the station. And they have a strong interest in robotic systems for lunar or Martian operations, any kind of surface operations. So I think you could look at any country that has a transportation capability would be a candidate for providing that. Partners who have developed human systems, learned about life support, built habitation systems, they would be candidates for that kind of a capability. I think there's many nations who have provided various types of scientific instruments for a range of planetary missions. And so if you want to look at what instruments would be provided for doing science on the surface, precursor missions, and then with humans, you can look at, who's got that kind of scientific expertise. And I know we went through the process before embarking on the space station program within NASA of internally just kind of cataloging what we knew about foreign partner interests and expertise to help us try and gauge, well, who's out there that would have a role to play and what kinds of things might they contribute. So I don't think you'll end up with any shocking surprises. You would look at what people have and how they could take those capabilities and apply them. And from a national perspective, if you can take those capabilities and develop them further and push their industry for new capabilities that are derived from that, or take their scientists that next step in an investigation on a path they've been following, those are the kinds of things that you would see nations focusing on for their contributions.
Can I elaborate on that just
Yes.
a little bit? Because I represent, in reality, a small spacefaring nation. And we admit that to ourselves, although we behave like a...
But they have a really big maple leaf that appears on the
But we've got a pretty
numbers.
good branding of behaving like the big guys and playing with the big guys. But in reality, other than the Canadarm, the shuttle and the station, most of our other contributions, and we have aspirations, of course, for robotics and the moon and Mars and blah, blah, blah. Most of our contributions are really high technology niche contributions. And I'll just give you one example because it's a typical example. We happen to have some very advanced LiDAR technology in Canada, which was used to form the basis of the meteorological instrument on the Mars Phoenix mission. It was really cool. It got Canadians' attention. We detected a snowfall on another planet for the first time ever. But this was a relatively minor, small, financially, I forget what the cost was, but it was, we just happened to have that niche technology which fitted with our scientific interest, which is Mars atmosphere, and we're able to make a contribution that was pretty visible on a very large mission. But it was a small contribution. And, lots of countries can do that. When I go to the ISU and speak, I talk about that, because a lot of the students there are from small spacefaring nations. Just follow Canada's example, find out what little niche technologies you've got hidden in your industries. You'd be surprised what you can do with them.
And good branding.
And good branding.
All right. Any other questions? Yes.
Dr. Pace, I suspect retrace the answer you just gave, but with Soyuz X aiming towards the lunar mission, does that present an opportunity to explore some of the policy mechanisms that are being discussed?
With Soyuz,
The advanced, Soyuz Advanced.
I mean, doing like the circumlunar?
Yeah, so that's still on the drawing board now in their program. We're sort of on the drawing board in our program, so we're kind of at the same sort of design interval.
Now, I don't know that technical capability presents really any driver or pressure on sort of the governance question. I think that the problem in each of the major spacefaring countries is that their policy foundation for doing human exploration generally is under great flux. I mean, everyone knows what it's like in the U.S. And there have been ripple effects of that into the other countries. I mean, in Europe, there's a debate, of course, going on about the future of human spaceflight beyond space station because, the Americans are uncertain where they're going. There's lots of pressures for other demands for dual-use technologies and programs like GMES and Galileo and so forth that present much more near-term pragmatic benefits, than human spaceflight looks like. Japan is the same way. The Democratic Party of Japan government that took over from the Liberal Democratic Party, which had ruled since 1954 with one exception, is not as enamored of human spaceflight and science as that has been JAXA's traditional strength. They're more interested in remote sensing and commercial technologies that would benefit industry. They're more interested actually in some national security systems, given that North Koreans occasionally fly missiles over their country without asking permission. So there are security and commerce issues that are also vying for attention in Japan. So in the environment where the U.S. is somewhat uncertain and doesn't have a clear architecture, although I'm very hopeful in the global exploration strategy, we can maybe create a new international consensus that the U.S. can join, that other countries have other pressures that are drifting away. And so you can have a wonderfully attractive technical idea, and it doesn't really overcome the fact that the policy foundations are still fluid. India, Brazil, South Africa, China, of course, South Korea, all are in sort of a similar mold. And so I think the governance question for those of us traditional ISS partners is to try to form a vision for going beyond space station, because once we do that, we can then start pulling in all these sort of other individual countries, and that leadership will coalesce. So not quite a direct answer to your question, but a bigger picture.
Okay, we're going to take one last question. The gentleman there with the microphone.
Quick question. We've talked a lot about government agencies and government roles in these. Governance models typically also involve non-traditional entities helping with the management of these systems. Are there other NGOs, academic institutions that we need to develop to facilitate the governance model?
Well, I mean, one of the things I think we would be really good to nail down, and with the other space agencies and non-spacefaring countries, is the use of non-terrestrial materials. I mean, we all know that the 67 Outer Space Treaty says that there's no claims of sovereignty in space. And it's very clear that once you remove non-terrestrial materials like the lunar rock samples, that you can then own those samples. But mining, separating, beneficiation of resources in situ, what safety areas and zones of control you can and should have around your bases and facilities, what role private sector companies can have and what rights they would have and recognition they would have in that environment of mixed utilization. I think those are all, some people look at property rights in space, that's a bigger theoretical discussion, but I think in a much more narrower sense, use of non-terrestrial materials and what role private sector entities working with government can and should have is probably maybe the next immediate issue, and I think that was something that needs to be addressed as part of the architecture discussions, because in many cases we'll be looking to non-government entities to provide some supporting services.
Okay. I would like to thank all of my panelists for their presentations and thoughts this afternoon, and thank all of you for your attention and helpful questions. Thank you.